the Bane Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, a fight to save the future of Eastern Europe, and a young sorcerer comes into his own. Plus, we continue our ongoing audiobook serialization of Timothy Zahn's Cobra, all right now. Welcome to the Bane Free Radio Hour. It's a pleasure to have you along. I am Bane Associate Editor and your podcast host, David Afsharirad. Today, we bring you DJ Butler's interview with Lois McMaster Bujold. Many of our listeners will be familiar with Bujold's best-selling, genre-defying Vorkosigan saga, but today she's here to talk about her Penric and Desdemona series. Previously available only as ebooks and limited edition small press hardcovers, the Penric and Desdemona stories follow a young sorcerer as he comes into his own. We've been pleased to bring these stories to a wider audience with our series of trade hardcovers, the first two of which were Penric's Travels and Penric's Progress. This month, we're rounding out the collection with Penric's Labor, which is the focus of today's interview. But first, the news. The November hardcovers are in. Let's take a look. First up, we have 1637, The Transylvanian Decision by Eric Flint and Robert E. Waters. Uptimer Morris Roth and his Grand Army of the Sunrise stand at a crossroads. Military success against the Polish-Lithuanian magnates has all but guaranteed a continued push east into Ruthenian lands. There, Roth hopes to further his Anaconda project so that tens of thousands of Jews are not slaughtered. Transylvania is thrown into political, social, and religious turmoil as battle lines are drawn. Whatever happens and whoever wins the fight, one thing is certain: the history of Eastern Europe will change radically. In fact, it already has. And next up, we have the subject of today's interview, Penric's Labors. 3 novellas of fantasy from Lois McMaster Bujold. Join young Penric as he journeys from young lord to sorcerer and scholar in the Bastard's Order. Includes Masquerade in Lodi, The Orphans of Raspe, and The Physicians of Vilnock, plus a new introduction, outroduction, and suggested reading order by Lois McMaster Bujold. That's 1637, The Transylvanian Decision, and Penric's Labors, out now in hardcover from Bane Books. And that's it for the news.
Hello, this is DJ Dave Butler. I'm here with Lois McMaster Bujold to talk about her new novel, Penric's Labors. It's out now in hardcover and in all your favorite ebook formats, always DRM free when you buy them at Baen.com, of course. Lois McMaster Bujold was born in 1949, the daughter of an engineering professor at Ohio State University, from whom she picked up her early interest in science fiction. She now lives in Minneapolis and has 2 grown children. She began writing with the aim of professional publication in 1982. She wrote 3 novels in 3 years. In October of 1985, all 3 sold to Bane Books, launching her career. Bujold went on to write many other books for Bane, mostly featuring her popular character Miles Naismith Vorkosigan, his family, friends, and enemies. Her fantasy novels from HarperCollins' Eos include the award-winning Chalian series and the Sharing Knife tetralogy. More recently, she has been exploring the novella length with Tales of the Sorcerer Penric and his demon Desdemona and other stories. Her works have been translated into over 20 languages. 10 times nominated for the Hugo Award for Best Novel, Bujold has won in that category 4 times. In 2017, the Vorkosigan saga received the first Hugo Award for Best Series, and in 2018, her World of the Five Gods series received the second. In 2020, Bujold was named the 36th Damon Knight Memorial Grand Master by the Science Fiction Writers of America. Lois, welcome to the Bane Free Radio Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're, I should say that I actually I know your science. I know more of your science fiction. I have read not the entire Vorkosigan saga, but a number. I've got a stack of them here on the floor that is my to be read.
Visual aids.
Yes. Well, yes. Well, but one of my several to be read piles around the house. But we're here to talk about your fantasy series, or one of your fantasy series. So and I want to talk at sort of the wider level about the setting, because the Penric stories are not the first explorations of the setting, right? Which is the 5GU, or the world of the five gods.
Right? Five gods, yeah.
Yeah, everything is.
It sounds like a computer part, you know.
It does, and everybody thinks they have a verse these days. This verse, that verse. Yeah, I like the world of the five gods better. Maybe tell us a little bit about your initial explorations in that setting. How did you start writing?
Okay, it goes back a long way to the turn of the millennium. I had finished a civil campaign for Bane, and I wanted to try my hand at a fantasy novel with an original setting. I had actually done for Bane The Spirit Ring back in the early 90s, which was my first fantasy novel. And it was okay, but you know, there were things like it was set in a kind of alternate Italy where magic worked, you know, that kind of cross between historical and fantasy. And I wanted to do something different this time around. So I embarked on what eventually became The Curse of Chalian. You know, new characters, new settings, new background, the whole 9 yards. And we sold that to HarperCollins, and they also picked up in the contract for a second book, which became Paladin of Souls, which won the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Locus Award around 2005. And that followed what had been a minor but pivotal character from the first book, followed her further adventures as she developed as a character and went on. And at that point, I was starting to think about, this could be a series, but I don't want to be structured like the Vorkosigan series, which was sort of one character having adventures inside a biographical arc. The Hornblower series is kind of an early example of that structure. So I thought, let's have a thematic structure with one book for each of the five gods. We've got two of them, we'll do another. And that got me into The Hallowed Hunt. And then I kind of stalled out. I didn't have any ideas for the two remaining gods. And, sort of took a sharp right into the tetralogy, the sharing knife, which is yet another series structure, which is one story broken up into 4 volumes. So it's like 1,600 pages, you know, so chopped down. But it is a continuous story arc, you know, complete in 4 volumes, plus one codicil novella that I wrote later. And that was, and then I went back to Baen and did some more Vorkosigan work. I did, not sure what order things are coming in now, but Cryoburn and eventually Gentleman Joel and the Red Queen. I think Diplomatic Immunity was in there somewhere. Yeah, that came in. I think it came in between the last two Chalian books. But so that, you know, that brought me up to, you know, the whatever we're calling this decade, or the just previous decade, the teens, I guess, the 20 teens. And I had finished Gentleman Joel and the Red Queen, and I was sort of at loose ends, and I could do anything, and I didn't quite know what. But there were several things I wanted to do. I wanted to have fun writing a really powerful sorcerer, because that's not something I had done before. And I wanted to try my hand at writing independent self-published e-novellas, or e-books, stories anyway, which is also something I had not done before. I'd done reprints, whatever you call them, when they're not actually printed, they're in pixels. So I thought, I will write a novella about a powerful sorcerer, and and do it as an indie and see what happens. And I got started on it and got to thinking about how to structure this one. And I find myself working my way back to Penric's beginning, when he first contracted his demon and became a sorcerer at the age of 19. And that became the story Penric's Demon, which was just a standalone at that point. But it was, the world was fraught with ideas and all kinds of unexplored corners. I continued to do research reading and get more ideas, and then I went on, and now I have written 11 Penric titles since then.
Fantastic. So in terms of reading the Penric stories, if you wanted to read them in order, roughly the order they're written, I think is also the chronological order, right? Penric's Demon is the first story. Oh, that's not true. Okay. Okay.
That was one of the things about having it as an a la carte ebooks, or was that, that it's a la carte. I could take one story from this part of the timeline and another story of that part of the timeline and write them in any order I want, and they would be out there loose, and people get pick them up as they wanted. But with the Bane collections, the three Bane, now coming up 3 Bane collections, we would put them in chronological order for you. So it follows the character's internal chronology through the 3 Penric volumes.
So it does begin with Penric's Demon, which is the story of how Penric becomes a sorcerer. We'll talk in a few minutes about kind of how that happens. But I suppose one thing I'm hearing is that if a reader went to a bookstore and the book that was available was didn't happen to be Penric's Progress, but they picked up Penric's Travels or Penric's Labors, they should be able to start there and read them in any order. Is that fair?
Yes, because each one is a collection of 3 novellas. All the novellas were expected to be read, separately. So the reader should be fine. I wrote an introduction for actually both the first and the second volumes that assured people that, yes, it's okay to read these. It's all right, you can read them. You can come back and get the rest later. It's kind of, it's like reading about my favorite characters in the stories in magazines when I was a young science fiction reader. There would be a Telsey story, and then I would find another one, and then I would find a back issue somewhere with yet another, oh boy, Telsey story. And collected them as they came to me and kind of put them together in my head as her biography, as it were. And so this is like magazine stories without the magazine. They're just, they're out there. You can take them in any order. If you read them in order, there will be fewer spoilers, because if you read about something that happened 6 years later, at least he survived the adventure, the prior adventure, and other things. So it should be okay.
And the relationship with the Chalian books is that they're set in the same world.
Correct.
So you see the same 5 gods, and you see sort of the same conventions of magic and places, but not necessarily a story interdependence.
It does not follow the same characters from the earlier books. So people who fell in love with the characters of the first book were sort of taken aback when the second book was about somebody else, and even more taken aback when the third book was about somebody else in another country 200 years earlier. But they eventually figured it out. So it was not ongoing characters. But it is in the same world with these same gods. Somebody once dubbed it speculative theology, because the theology of the world is quite important to the world building.
That's interesting. Well, let's talk about the theology just a minute, but I have another sort of, I guess, question. Maybe it's a bit of an observation. This is not Earth.
Right.
But it's a setting that in some ways lies very close to Earth in ways that you have sort of knitted into even like language and names. So for example, Penric travels around to little villages, a couple little villages whose names end in the syllable Beck, right? Chilbeck, and I forget the other one. Well, that's a real English language Earth naming convention, right? And Beck is I think it's an old Anglo-Saxon word, which means creek, right?
Right.
And so there are real towns and villages.
Named
with
the
that
tag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or similarly, and I found this very delightful. Penric travels. This is the title suggests. But in the beginning, his adventures are in and around the Wild, which is a real place. Which is there is such a it's the old English word for
The name, yeah, it's the old English name for woods.
Yep.
But in this case, it's the name of a country which is unrelated to England.
Well, no, that's right. But actually, there's a specific forest. It's the forest between the North and the South Downs and South. I know this because I lived on the edge of it for 4 years. Yeah. So these places, it's so as you read the stories, right? It's not that it's set in England or that it's set in Venice or that it's set in another, but it's set in places that are very reminiscent of that feel like, oh, this sort of feels like I'm in England, right? This kind of feels like I'm now on the continent somewhere. I mean, this is clearly deliberate. So I guess my question is, tell me what you're going for here. Tell me why you wrote this way.
Okay. Well, there's the whole thing about names, which we'll come back to, but sort of the way I use history and the real world for inspiration for this is not because I want to write an historical novel or because I want to write a historical critique. It's I use history and our world as the way an artist uses reference photos to get the proportions right and get a quick mock-up so that everything fits together without having to spend as much time as Tolkien spent on it to put it together. And the other thing about setting up these resonances is I'm writing at novella length, and that means I don't have a lot of space for world building. I don't have 1,600 words for this, for a Penric novella, to give a sense of place, a sense of history, a sense of the surround. So using these resonances allows me to call up from the reader things that they know. So it's just off, and yet they'll bring out from their own memories and information these associations that fill in the blanks that I've left. So it works as a kind of play with the reader to make them do more work. So that's what's going on with the world building. And plus it's because I'm pulling a lot of ideas from historical inspiration, but I don't want to be tied to history. It allows me that elbow room to play with these concepts and ideas. So that's what's happening there. Now with the names, making up names is a burden for me. But I've discovered a trick. This is sort of like telling you how sausages are made, but to get names in an area that all sound like they come from the same language, is you take your area of the map, chop up all the place names into syllables and recombine them. So they're all coming out of one language, but they're not that language. So that the place names in the Weald will sound different from the place names in Adria, which will sound different again from the place names in Sidonia, because they're all from different parts of the map. Now, in the case of something like Spain, there's already 6 languages on the map that they've acquired over the years. So it's like doubly remixed, but it gives a way to give a sense of unity to all these hundreds of made up names.
Yeah.
And once again, it draws on that subliminal sense of familiarity to make the reader feel like they kind of know what's going on.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Is there a map of the world of 5 gods, by the way? I look for one only briefly.
Well, there's a partial one. I'm not sure if we got it into the Bane volumes, but there's one of the kind of the area around the adventures. Actually, we made it up that map for the pirate story for the Orphans of Raspe. but there's also a map online that the fans made. If you go to the Vorkosigan wiki or the Chalian wiki somewhere, you'll find it. It's more extensive and less canonical because I reserve the right to shift geography wherever I need it for the story.
Of course, yeah. Okay, fantastic. I love the sort of thoughtfulness about names. That's very interesting. So speculative theologies, the five gods. Tell us about, and this has everything to do with Penric, right? I mean, his story is deeply tied to specifically
all of the stories are.
Yeah. So tell us about the five gods then.
Okay, they started back in the Curse of Chalian when I was writing this story about Casserole and I needed a background religion, and that my thinking about them has grown over the course of 20 years of writing this.
Sure.
But they are very naturalistic gods. There's five: their mother, father, daughter, and son, and then the bastard, the fifth god. So the four gods are the gods of the four seasons, and the four fingers of the hand, and they're very very organic that way. And the bastard is the god of everything else, all the bits that don't fit, and he touches every other finger, and so he's the trickster god, trickster figure. The others all have their they're more expected from the names, seasons and whatnot. The father is the father of winter. He's the god of justice, of male fertility, of winter, of course. Older men. The daughter of spring is the daughter of girls and young women, virgins, and early childhood education, as it turns out. The mother of summer is your basic mother goddess, but she's also the patroness of medicine, and female fertility. And the son of autumn is the god for the dudes. If your last words are here lads, hold my ale and watch this, you're going to the sun momentarily. And also autumn and the harvest, hunt, comradeship, and thus war. So he's involved in all that kind of autumn tune things, and then the bastard floats in all seasons. So they are conceived by humans as being a kind of holy family, but their actual reality is something very different. They are not like the Greek gods. They are not humans writ large. They are genuinely not human. I see them as being evolved from the world. The substance of the world, the life of the world, has become the gods over evolutionary time. There is in Paladin of Souls a sermon by a character named Divine de Cabin, which has kind of the origin story of the gods and of the bastard. So there's a little bit of that in there. I should probably put in more mythology as I go along. But we had the father, the mother, then we had the son and the daughter, and then the bastard came along later. And they are absorbent gods. Basically, they absorb all the life and death of the world. And so when you die and go to the gods, you genuinely join the god. You become, part of the godhead, which is a little bit alarming. Do you keep your identity or not? It's really unclear. If you have 100 years, even if you keep your identity immediately after death, if you have 100 years on Earth and 10,000 years as part of this other existence, which is going to loom larger in your character. So it's tricky.
That's interesting.
That's kind of the back. The characters of my world don't think of it in the terms I think of it. They think of it differently, but that's my world building take on it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That question about retaining your personality kind of is mirrored in the chaos demons that Penric, the demon singular, right? That gives Penric they make him a sorcerer, give him power. So there is a heresy, right? What's it called? The quadripartite heresy?
Yeah, the quadrant heresy is, if you've got a religion, you're going to have heresies and people with other opinions. The quadrines think that there are only 4 gods, that the 5th god is a demon, not a god. They don't deny his existence, they deny his
divinity.
So he's set up, they set up, one of the things I set up this 5-point theology to do is to resist dualism, which I think is usually a mistake. It's a mistake that a whole bunch of people like a whole lot, but the world is always more complex than that. So basically, the quadrine heresy reinvents dualism and tries to make things black and white, simple again, when it's not.
Yeah, by making one of them into a demon, so it's 4 versus 1. It's good.
4 versus 1. It's like we know we will be on the good side, and we'll know we're okay. None of this ambiguity and moral grayness.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so the bastard. So he's the trickster god. He's the god of ribald poetry. And he has this association with these kind of chaos demons, right? And it's the chaos demons that make a sorcerer. So what are these demons like, and how does a chaos demon give a human power?
Yeah, how does this work? Yeah, in the world of Chalian, the gods in general have no power in the physical world. They can only reach people's thoughts. They can only get things done in the world by reaching people and getting people to do it. Yeah. The line on that is, the gods have no hands but ours. The demon, the bastard, is as usual, kind of the thumb on the scale. He's gets around this a little bit. His chaos demons are released into the world. They're little blobs of chaos. They call them elementals when they first appear. And they are taken up by animals or humans or whatever they can find, because nothing of spirit can exist in the world of matter without a creature of matter to support it. So if they fail to find a host immediately, they would evaporate back into chaos. And as they join a host, they learn, they imprint, they become what the person or the animal is. When the person or the animal dies, they can jump to another and sort of slowly start building up personality and knowledge over time. So every demon is different because every demon has a different history. They are neither good nor evil to start as an elemental. They are blanks. So everything that is good or evil about a demon, they pick up from their humans. Yeah, it is all learned behavior. And so a demon who gets a string of good people can become a good and powerful force, become brought into the temple and used for all kinds of constructive things. And a demon who gets spoiled by bad riders, becomes dangerous and has to be eliminated one way or another. So upon that, various things. So demons have certain physical powers. They can do magic, but because this world obeys the laws of thermodynamics, every time they do magic that creates more order, they have to shed a larger amount of disorder. Although if they do magic that just creates disorder, it is not as costly. So one of the things you have to learn as a sorcerer is how to manage this flow of chaos and order, so that you don't become exploded like a sausage, or otherwise heat, overheat, or other issues. It becomes very complex and is played out in the stories, and as a reader you kind of learn about it incident by incident, item by item. So it's
and there's sort of a perpetual moral kind of dimension to it, right? Because essentially it's easy for Penric, and he names his demon Desdemona. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. There's sort of this question, like the demon is an elemental force, right? Does it actually have a personality? Is it just the residue of the 12 previous, right? But he names his demon Desdemona, and Desdemona and he, with Desdemona's power in him, are very good at destroying things, right? but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's very good at, evil, right? Or that's the only route, because you could destroy a tumor or lice. There are funny little passages where, all the dead bugs.
Kidney stones is one of the things they destroy.
Kidneys,
That's good.
right?
There's all kinds of ways destruction can be used for good, and part of the study of sorcery is to figure out, how to use destruction creatively, well, in ways that aid people. And then the next level of magic up is how to use magic that is puts things together. Creative, uphill magic. And then how to shed the excess chaos in ways that are safe for everyone around you and yourself.
There's an early scene. So this is a setting in which there are, we're like right on the verge of the printing press. So that there are some books are printed and some are not. There's still some hand copying.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a great sequence early on where Penric, let's see, I think he hand copies out a page, and then he at the same time uses Desdemona's power to create a printing block of that page, which is adding order, and also destroy the thing he just made, which is the counterbalancing action.
Yeah.
So it doesn't cost him too much, or so it's a permissible.
Yeah. So he's able to produce this printing block, which then can be taken away and used as an ordinary printing block.
Yep.
By non-magical people, for like much less cost than carving it out, by hand, the way some cultures did. Early printing in China was like from hand carved plates.
Yeah, very interesting. So okay, so let's talk a little about the first story. Okay, I mean the Penric's demon. So who is Penric? Like before he gets a demon, who is this guy? What does his life look like? Where's he going?
Okay, well, Penric is a feckless young man. Well, he's not actually very feckless. He's pretty conscientious. But he is a young man who grew up the seventh and youngest in the family of a minor country lord, Baron, in basically Five Gods Universe, Switzerland. He's a backcountry kid. Yep. And at age 19, he is on his way to be betrothed. He needs to make a wealthy marriage because his family is not doing all that great. His middle brother had gone off to be a mercenary and promptly got killed. So there was nothing coming in from there. The elder brother inherited the crumbling, semi-crumbling estate. Was going to be the Baron after their father. So he was supposed to marry the daughter of a wealthy cheese merchant, which he was okay with. It wasn't exactly the life he wanted. He wanted to go to university, not because he had any particularly scholarly ambition, but because he wanted to get out of this little village. But he was going to have to give that up. And on the road, this is not much of a spoiler because this all happens in the first scene of the first story. He comes across a moment where an elderly woman traveling with the party has fallen from her horse and apparently very ill. He stops to help. She dies, and she turns out to have been a temple sorceress, and her demon, as demons do when their mount dies, jumps to Penric as the new mount, as the new person. The metaphor, the easy metaphor that is used to describe this is rider and ridden. And it can switch back and forth depending on who's in charge, whether the demon in this is ascendant, whether the human is driving the car. It's one of the dangers of sorcery is that your demon can become ascendant and kind of run off with your body and take possession. But if you have possession of the demon and there's some cooperation going, you get the use of these powers and the direction of these powers. So Penric was not expecting this. It was nowhere in his ideas for what he would be doing. So he woke up, with the demon on board, and then proceeded to have to learn how to manage it, and got sent off to learn how And this is the story of Penric's demon.
Yeah. So he's not a bad guy, right? I mean, he's a basically good kid. In fact, Rukia, as she's dying, I don't know if it's Rukia or if it's the demon, basically asks his permission, right? And he doesn't know what he's consenting to, but he says, yes, right, I'm here to help.
Whatever you need.
Whatever
That's
you
very
need.
open-ended. Oops.
There he's saddled with that. So so his family, like minor lord, so landed but not rich, because his skills are he can hunt and he can climb, because they had land, but he had to go shoot sheep to eat. The first story is about the sort of temple deciding, what do we do with this guy? Has this demon become ascendant? Do we need to destroy it? What do we do to him? So I like the metaphor, by the way, the writing. This is like another great example of how it's another great example of a real earth resonance, right? Because it's very close to the language of like Vodun, people talking about being a horse for the Mystères, for the Loa, when they, in close connection with, or maybe you might say possessed by, by one of the powers, right? So this is that language, or close to it. Okay, so that's a lot of fun now, but it's not the only kind of magic in the world of the five gods. So another example of magic you've got is shamanism. So and here again, you're very close to real world practices in a lot of ways here. So tell me about the shamans of the world of five gods. What is a shaman?
There's a second sort of magic besides the chaos demons. And this was actually first developed for the novel The Hallowed Hunt, when I worked out the rules of how this would work and all the procedures. But it is a kind of building up of a spirit through animal sacrifice. And this goes back to the old Weald, which was like old Saxon Germany tribal thing, inspired by back when they were the forest tribes. They developed all these techniques, and the idea is you sacrifice an animal into another animal, usually the same sex and species, and it gets an enhanced soul or spirit. And then you sacrifice it into another and into another and into another. And if you get it up high enough, you get one that if you sacrifice it into a human, the human has magical powers.
Yeah.
That's the other way you can become a magician in this world, is to receive a great beast and become a shaman. There's a whole culture around that. That's not the only practice. There's spirit warriors that had animal spirits sacrificed into them so they would be more fierce. There's a whole backstory about a war between the forest tribes and Darthica, which was kind of like Five Gods Universe France, if you like. And it's actually somewhat inspired by the stories of Emperor Charlemagne fights with across the border there. But that's deep backstory. It does not immediately impinge on Penric. But it means there's this whole culture. The shamanism was suppressed for a period after Great Adar's conquests, Darthican conquest, and then hundreds of years later, it fell apart. The country became independent again, and the story of the Hallowed Hunt is sort of the story about how shamanism was rediscovered and brought in as an allowed thing again by the temple. So when we fast forward to Penric's time, which is about 150 years after the Hallowed Hunt, shamanism has been developed. They have royal shamans at the capital of the Weald in East Home, and they're trying to recover the old learning and learn new things. And so the second story in Penric's Progress, that first collection, is about how Penric meets a shaman and has to solve his problems, which he's gotten into very deeply. So it's shamanism and chaos sorcery, compare and contrast. That's what's going on in that story.
Yeah.
And the third story in that volume picks up what makes you think it's going to go in the same direction, except that it doesn't. It picks up the characters developed in the second story. Gives them another adventure.
Yeah. There's so one of Penric's comrades. So he has this one of these shamans as a comrade for a time, and this is in Penric's Progress, the first volume. But another is he called an inquirer? Is that right?
Yeah, it's kind of a police detective.
Yeah, so like an inquisitor, not quite, right? Associated with the father and that idea of justice.
Yep. So that's that's the god he's working for and is loyal to because of his career, because of his vocation, really.
Yeah.
So he was a fun character to develop. But then, of course, I get to the next book and I go in a completely different direction, which is to take Penric to Sidonia, which actually got mentioned in the first story when he was reading the books in the library. He suddenly found he could read Sidonian.
Mm-hmm.
Was starting to imagine being in this distant and fabulous country. So the next three adventures in Penric's travels take him to Sidonia, and we get a little tour as he goes around. But that brings us to Penric's Labors.
Yeah, very good.
Which is what we're supposed to be talking about.
Ostensibly, we're talking about that one, yeah. So I want to hear about those stories, but like as a comment or maybe a question, it seems to me that the genre of the stories sometimes it's a little genre flexible, right? Like that story, the third story in Penric's Progress is something close to a police procedural. It's a murder mystery.
Exactly.
Which has this interesting twist tied into the whole sorcery and demons stuff. So I guess I'm curious, like how do you think about genre? Do you consciously write stories in different genres with Penric here, or is it just a matter of as it unfolds?
I developed this back when I was writing the Borkosigan series. I regard genres as a buffet table, and I can take whatever I want. From the smorgasbord. Why limit yourself to just one? Because the characters are in a whole world. They have to. That world has to contain every possible kind of story. So there's no reason to limit the series, unless you're following a particular line. It depends on series structure. So this was the thing about series structure that I learned from the Borkosigan series that I brought to the Penric stories. That you're not, there is no limit. You can do anything you want, but that the character will allow. Some characters cannot carry certain stories. It's just not within their range. But if you have a character with a range, like Miles and like Penric, they can do several different kinds of stories and not violate their character. But back in the Curse of Chalian, and when I wrote Paladin of Souls, I needed a different character to explore different aspects in the second book, and again in the third. So where were we? We were discussing.
So I'd love to hear actually one last I don't know, comment. One of the reasons I love your inclusion of shamanism, again, this kind of real world resonance. This is one of the great, really widespread sort of spiritual, very old gifts of humankind, one of our old inheritances on earth. And if you read anthropology or magical studies or religious studies, you all the time run across this complex of ideas. So shamanism per se is Altaic, it's from Central Asia, but all the time you'll say, well, here are these complex of ideas among the Orphics or among the Algonquins that are shamanistic, right? And the core idea is somebody who discorporates from their own body and can enter a new realm. And classically, your ability to act in that realm makes you a healer and otherwise kind of a magical person. And And classically, you have a kind of a second soul, right? Which is often an animal form. And so, you kind of took this sort of little Germanic feeling, like you said, the sort of animal sacrifice as the mechanism for creating the second soul of these shamans. But otherwise it's very resonant with real world, real world stuff. So it's wonderful. It feels very real to me as I'm.
That's on purpose.
Yeah,
it's you to do the work. Penric's Labors is the next three Penric stories, and we were talking about different genres, and I've got actually three different genres in that book. The first story, which was actually written later, because once again, I'm not stuck on the timeline. I can move around if I can manage. The first story is set during his year in Adria, so it actually falls between Penric's progress and Penric's travels. So that's right. And then we have two stories that follow after all the stories in Penric's travels, but sort of squish them together. So the first one is an adventure in basically Penric's world's Venice. I had a lot of fun using all my old Venice research in that one. And it is, what would I call it? It is a theological mystery. It is not a murder mystery, but he comes across a situation that that requires his magical. It is his magical duty. A young man is fished up from the sea who has been possessed by a spoiled demon, and Penric's job is to get this kid and take him before the saint, whose job it is to remove bad demons. He's run off, and so the adventure is tracking him down and trying to get this whole problem solved. And the Saint of Lodi turns out to be a trip. She was an amazing character. Quite surprised me. I had no idea who she was when I started. I knew he was going to go find a saint, and when we arrived, it was this 18-year-old girl. What? Who had her own ideas about how the story should go. Kind of took charge. The second story, The Orphans of Raspe, jumps forward to Penric's sojourn in the Duchy of Orbis, which was sort of next door to the Empire of Sidonia. And he's actually on a ship coming back from a diplomatic mission and is captured by pirates. So I got to play with what I think about pirates. And he finds himself, rescuing himself would have been fairly easy, but he finds himself sort of in charge of two orphan girls who are also part of the pirates' catch. And so escaping with them turns out to be a lot more difficult. And then the third story, The Physicians of Vilnock, is the one I started at the end of 2019. And it is a story about Penric dealing with a plague, because he is also a physician sorcerer, which comes up variously in the other sorcerers, in the other stories. And so that story focused in on those issues. What should I say about that?
That's quite some timing.
Yeah, the timing was really unfortunate. But I wasn't pulling, people think it was inspired by the COVID pandemic. It had nothing to do with the COVID pandemic, which is nothing new. We've had pandemics and diseases and whatnot through history. Probably, all of which fed into the background that went into this story of Penric at home in Vilnock, suddenly having to deal with a desperately threatening disease. It was new, but probably the historical person who was most inspired that story is Walter Reed, whom I read a kid's biography about back in 5th grade, which makes it like 60 years ago, that made a huge impression on me, evidently, because I was thinking about Walter Reed and his discovering the true cause of yellow fever in his tropical medicine research back when, which is why they named the Army Hospital after him. So that the idea of being able to explore medical research at a time when it all hadn't been invented yet was part of what was going on with that story.
That kind of raises an interesting point, and I maybe worth making. We talk about Penric's magics being destructive from the beginning, right? He, as you say, he hadn't wanted to go to university necessarily to be a scholar, but he already sort of thought of himself as a person who was, a thinker and sort of the combination of the demon's capabilities. Hey, suddenly I speak and read new languages.
That's authorial wish fulfillment there.
Yeah. Oh, I hear you.
Languages.
But also suddenly becoming basically sort of a person with access to temples and libraries, and also having this sudden ontological change, right? Like suddenly he has this thing, really makes him he's a thinking hero, right? Like he researches and yes, his magic is to light things on fire and cause them. Yeah. But the stories don't usually win. They don't end in a climax because Penric causes the bad guy to explode, right? That's not the nature of the stories.
Yeah, it's actually killing with this magic is forbidden by the rules of the magic. He would lose his demon.
Yeah.
If he killed with directly with this magic. Now, if he picked up his bow and shot somebody, he'd be in no worse case than anyone else who did the same deed. But it means that he has to take care with this magic. He does not harm. So he's kind of the antithesis of the military hero, which I had explored with Miles. Yeah, he's a man who cannot kill or will not kill. He has to find other ways to solve problems, other kinds of problems. So that's been a lot of fun to kind of have the anti-Miles.
Yeah. So the stories have a riddle, or it has to be unraveled, or right. There's
got to give the hero something to do for 100 pages. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, so this is the third collection. Each of these is 3 novellas. There are 2 other stories, Penric stories, outside the Bane published sequence, right? Because you were telling us earlier that
there's 2 more that follow. The Assassins of Thassalon, which started out to be a novella but grew into a novel, and Knot of Shadows, which is another sort of shorter theological mystery that takes place back in Vilnock.
Yeah. And a reader could just find those on Amazon if they wanted, presumably?
Yeah, they're available. They're all available as ebooks. They're on Amazon, Nook, iTunes, or iBooks, or Apple Books, or whatever they're calling it these days. And we've just gotten on Cobra. So they're out there.
Yeah. So do you have plans to write more Penric stories? Like what causes you to say, it's time to write another Penric story? Is it a kind of idea that hits you?
Yeah, there's ideas have a certain, I don't know, idea density that says this is a story that, I don't know what it's going to be, but it feels like it, it could unfold into something. This is kind of in the solar plexus. And those come along once in a while. But I kind of have to prime the pump a little bit, which I haven't been doing much lately of. I have to be a little bit more focused than I've been. But yeah, the ideas come, and then they become a story, and I get started on them, and they get difficult, but I can't leave them alone because I can't waste the however many words I've written so far, and I find my way to the end of it.
Yeah. What do you do to prime the pump? That's a provocative phrase. Is that?
Yeah. Well, it's mostly taking in the right kind of information, and other stimulus. Reading, of course, or learning new things, I guess. Learning new things about history, being reminded of old things I knew. So a story never starts with one idea. It always starts with 2 or 3 or 6 that suddenly come together and create this critical mass. So it's having one idea can lie in the compost heap of your memory for years, and be completely useless, and then some other thing will come in and pull it out, and suddenly you have a connection, and you have something that sparks
the
story.
I love that. So do you read a lot of nonfiction then? You have a big nonfiction library?
I do. What's behind me is kind of the remains of my nonfiction library. I haven't been reading so much lately. I have eye issues. Macular pucker. You can look it up on Wikipedia. But so I've been mostly reading on my tablet, like the print really big. But I've been watching. The other thing I've been doing the last few years, I've been watching anime for decades, but I've lately fallen into watching live action Asian media, which is newly accessible with all the streaming sites and finding all that. And my take on that is it's like discovering science fiction at the age of 12. I don't understand it all, but it's really cool and I want to see more. That same feeling, golden age of science fiction is 12. That line, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's
moment of first
having a golden age with my second adolescence.
of anime, or of live action Asian.
Strange things I don't understand, but pretty cool.
Yeah, fun. So, so you don't have any other Penric stories planned right now, though. We'll see.
At the moment, I'm semi-retired, which means I write when I want to, and when I don't, I go do something else. Which is, I will be. Penric's Labors is coming out practically on my birthday. I will be 73 next month. I figure I can be semi-retired if I want.
Happy birthday! That seems fair.
Yeah, so it was a very good birthday present from Bane.
So are there other projects that you are working on that you want to talk about, or any other books that are coming out maybe from other publishers?
I haven't been a complete slacker this year. I did do a private project or a personal project, not private. I had come down through the family a set of documents from the Civil War. There were 2 diaries, and it turned out my brother had a memoir also from the same family, the Bujold family of New Hampshire, which is my mother's family tree. And back in the early 70s, I remember my mother transcribing from these little handwritten diaries, and she made a typescript. And it looked like this.
Wow. Yeah.
And they made copies, and one of the copies came to me, so that we had these couple of copies of these Civil War. There's a diary of a young man who was medic on the Eastport, which was a Union ironclad ram in the Red River campaign. The diary for the same year of his mother back in New Hampshire, and then a memoir written later by his older brother, who was my great-great-grandfather, that kind of tied it all together. And I'd had the 2 diaries, but I hadn't had the memoir until just recently. There's a whole thing about it on my blog at Goodreads about WikiTree inviting me to be a guest for genealogy stuff for a week. So anyway, here's a picture of the Eastport.
That's very cool, and that's neat that the WikiTree. So they asked you for, like, give me your 4 grandparents' names and birth dates, and we'll see what we can.
And then we will turn our group loose and sort of crowdsource your genealogy. It's just a thing, and for 1 week, it's like a cross between Time Team and Genealogy Club.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of fun for them and for me. And as I say, there's more about it on my blog if anyone is interested. But it reminded me of this thing that had been sitting on my shelf for decades. And I pulled it out and got to looking at it and say, I could make this into an ebook. I know how to make an ebook. So I did. And that is now up on Amazon only. It's titled The Bujold Family of New Hampshire in the Civil War, 2 Diaries and a Memoir, which is just what it says on the tin. So people can go see this stuff. It's fascinating to read the diaries because they're so raw. They're unedited. They're not assumed to be an audience. They're not made into a narrative, but they build, they accumulate as you read, and it's very befuddling at first because you don't know any of the references, but slowly it fills in and you get a sense of these people's lives, the world that they lived in, which is in some ways very like ours. Martin, the kid on the riverboat, talks about reading The Autocrat and the Breakfast Table, which is a book I could pull off the shelf anywhere, and we're still reading it. And then he talks about things that are totally alien to our world.
Yeah.
So it was fun.
Very cool. What a terrific project. Okay, is there anything else we haven't talked about that you wanna let Bane readers know about or want to discuss?
I think we've pretty much filled an hour here. Maybe a little over.
No, we're good. We're
Short
good.
questions, long answers. I'm one of those people too. So I think it's just, Penric's Labors will be out in a very short time.
Yeah.
And people should go enjoy it.
Yep. In fact, it should be out by the time this interview is posted, or if not, shortly after. November 1st is the release date. Fantastic. Well, once again, the book is Penric's Labors, out from Baen in hardcover and ebook. Lois Bujold, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
It's fun.
And now we bring you Timothy Zahn's Cobra. Earth's only hope was the Cobras. The colony worlds Adirondack and Silvern fell to the Troft forces almost without a struggle. Outnumbered and on the defensive, Earth made a desperate decision. It would attack the aliens not from space, but on the ground, with forces the Trofts did not even suspect. Thus were created the Cobras, a guerrilla force whose weapons were surgically implanted, invisible to the unsuspecting eye, yet undeniably deadly. But power brings temptation, and not all the Cobras could be trusted to fight for Earth alone. Johnny Moreau would learn the uses and abuses of his special abilities and what it truly meant to be a Cobra.
Dinner that night was a festive occasion. Irena Moreau had cooked her son's favorite meal, center-fired wild balice, and the conversation was light and frequently punctuated by laughter. The warmth and love seemed to Johnny to fill the room, surrounding the five of them with an invisible defense perimeter. For the first time since leaving Asgard, he felt truly safe, and tensions he'd forgotten he even had began to drain slowly from his muscles. It took most of the meal for the others to bring Johnny up to date on the doings of Cedar Lake's people, so it wasn't until Irena brought out the cave that conversation turned to Johnny's plans. "I'm not really sure," Johnny confessed, holding his mug of cave with both hands, letting the heat soak into his palms. "I suppose I could go back to school and finally pick up that computer tech certificate, but that would take another year, and I'm not crazy about being a student again. Not now, anyway." Across the table, Jamie sipped cautiously at his mug. "If you went to work, what sort of job would you like?" he asked. "Well, I'd thought of coming back to the shop with Dadder, but you seem to be pretty well settled in there." Jamie darted a glance at his father. "Heck, Johnny, there's enough work in town for 3 of us, right, Dadder?" "Sure," Pierce replied with only the barest hesitation. "Thanks," Johnny said, "but it sounds like you're really too low on equipment for me to be very useful. And my thought is that maybe I could work somewhere on my own for a few months until we can afford to outfit the shop for 3 workers. Then, if there's enough business around, I could come and work for you." Pierce nodded. "That sounds really good, Johnny. I think that's the best way to do it. So back to the original question," Jamie said. "What kind of job are you going to get?" Johnny held his mug to his lips for a moment, savoring the rich minty aroma. Army cave had a fair taste and plenty of stimulant, but was completely devoid of the fragrance that made a good scent drink so enjoyable. "I've learned a lot about civil engineering in the past 3 years, especially in the uses of explosives and sonic cutting tools. I figure I'll try one of the road construction or mining companies you were telling me about that are working south of town." "Can't hurt to try," Pierce shrugged. "Going to take a few days off first?" "Nope. I'll head out there tomorrow morning. I figured I'd drive around town for a while this evening, though. Get reacquainted with the area. Can I help with the dishes before I go?" "Don't be silly," Irena smiled at him. "Relax and enjoy yourself." "Tonight, that is," Jamie amended. "Tomorrow you'll be put out in the salt mines with the rest of the new slaves." Johnny leveled a finger at him. "Beware the darkness of the night," he said with mock seriousness. "There just may be a pillow out there with your name on it." He turned back to his parents. "Okay if I take off, then? Anything you need in town?" "I just shopped today," Irena told him. Go ahead, son, Pierce said. I'll be back before it gets too late. Johnny downed the last of his cave and stood up. Great dinner, Mommer. Thanks a lot. He left the room and headed toward the front door. To his mild surprise, Jamie tagged along. You coming with me? Johnny asked. Just to the car, Jamie said. He was silent until they were outside the house. I wanted to clue you in on a couple of things before you left, he said as they set off across the lawn. Okay, shoot. Number one, I think you ought to be careful about pointing your finger at people, like you did at me a few minutes ago, especially when you're looking angry or even just serious. Johnny blinked. Hey, I didn't mean anything by that. I was just kidding around. I know that, and it didn't bother me. Someone who doesn't know you as well might have dived under the table. I don't get it. Why? Jamie shrugged, but met his brother's eyes. They're a little afraid of you, he said bluntly. Everybody followed the war news pretty closely out here. They all know what Cobras can do. Johnny grimaced. It was beginning to sound like a repeat of that last awkward conversation with Ilona Linder, and he didn't like the implications. What we could do, he told Jamie, perhaps a bit more sharply than necessary. Most of my armament's gone, and even if it wasn't, I sure wouldn't use it on anyone. I'm sick of fighting. I know, but they won't know that, not at first. I'm not just guessing here, Johnny. I've talked to a lot of kids since the war ended, and they're pretty nervous about seeing you again. You'd be surprised how many of them are scared that you'll remember some old high school grudge and come by to settle accounts. Oh, come on, Jamie, that's ridiculous. That's what I tell the ones that ask me about it, but they don't seem convinced. And it looks like some of their parents have picked up on the attitude too, and heck, you know how news travels around here. I think you're going to have to bend over backwards for a while. Be as harmless as a dove with blunted toenails. Prove to them they don't have to be afraid of you. Johnny snorted. The whole thing is silly, but okay. I'll be a good little boy. Great. Jamie hesitated. Now for number 2, I guess. Were you planning to stop by and see Elise Karn tonight? That thought had crossed my mind. Johnny frowned, trying to read his brother's expression. Why? Has she moved? No, she's still living out on Blakely Street, but you might want to call before you go over there, to make sure she isn't busy. Johnny felt his eyes narrow slightly. What are you getting at? She living with someone? Oh, no, it hasn't gone that far, Jamie said quickly. But she's been seeing Doan Etheridge a lot lately, and, well, he's been calling her his girlfriend. Johnny pursed his lips, staring past Jamie at the familiar landscape beyond the Moreau property. He could hardly blame Elise for finding someone new in his absence. They hadn't exactly been the talk of Cedar Lake when he left, and 3 years would have been a pretty long wait even if they had been more serious about each other. And yet, along with his family, Elise had been one of his psychological anchors when things on Adirondack had gotten particularly bad, a focal point for thoughts and memories involving something besides blood and death. Just having her around was bound to help in his readjustment to civilian life, and besides, to step aside meekly for the likes of Doan Etheridge was completely unthinkable. I suppose I'll have to do something about that, he said slowly. Catching Jamie's expression, he forced a smile. Don't worry, I'll steal her back in a civilized manner. Yeah, well, good luck. I'll warn you, though. He's not the drip he used to be. I'll keep that in mind. Johnny slid his hand idly along the smooth metal of the car. Familiarity all around him. And yet, somehow, it was all different, too. Perhaps, his combat instincts whispered, it would be wiser to stay at home until he knew more about the situation here. Jamie seemed to sense the indecision. You still going out? Johnny pursed his lips. Yeah, I think I'll take a quick look around. Opening the door, he slid in and started the engine. Don't wait up, he added as he drove off. After all, he told himself firmly, he had not fought troughs for 3 years to come home and hide from his own people. Nevertheless, the trip through Cedar Lake felt more like a reconnaissance mission than the victorious homecoming he had once envisioned. He covered most of the town, but stayed in the car and didn't wave or call to the people he recognized. He avoided driving by Elise Karn's apartment building completely, and he was home within an hour.
That was another installment in Timothy Zahn's Cobra, and that's it for the podcast. Thanks as always to Audible.com and podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Praise, thanks, and gratitude to Grandmaster Lois McMaster Bujold for sitting down and chatting with us today. And good night, Tony Daniel, wherever you are. This is David F. Shirod coming to you from a soundproof bunker somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Join us here next week at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.